So we talk about where is beating hoarding on your priority list. In many regards, we want to make sure that it stays at the top of your priority list. You are not in any way, moving it down the priority list, because as we know, the only way it demonstrates a level of sustainability and really the benefits of it is to have it top of your priority list. Remember, careful scheduling is required to keep motivated and to working at your best. You need to ensure that it's scheduled in, is part of your daily activity. It's a major aspect of what you do each day. Try to find a time when you know you will have the greatest mental alertness enough to do the task and the fewest distractions or competing interests. And we talk about really figuring out during our day when we are the most alert, when we have the greatest mental capacity, the cognitive wherewithal. And for some people it's in the morning, some people it's in the evening, some people it's midday. What you have to find that niche for yourself and be able to kind of work through that process. So the question then is, are you letting your lower priority things interfere with beating hoarding? And that's a major obstacle for a number of people. Really letting other things become a priority. And whether by conscious action or whether by default, hoarding slips on the priority list. So to really look at how we can focus on not just the priority, but how we establish hoarding and addressing hoarding and decluttering and discarding as a goal for us, is to really revisit the goal development. The change plan worksheet. It's a motivational enhancement strategy that really identifies the step you can take towards your goal. So you have an opportunity to envision the future, and you consider people who can help you there. You create strategies to help you process and identify signs that you're making progress. So when we look at the change plan worksheet, we're looking at the changes I want to make. So this is really in small bits, in a real segmented way, in a way process-oriented way, establishing those elements that are going to keep you focused. What's the most important reason why I want to make these changes? So it's really taking you back to ground zero, to step one. Why did you start this whole process? Why did you prioritize this activity? And why it remains critically important to you? What steps I plan to take in making the change? So really revisit these elements. Look at the questions. You list specific ways that others can help support you in your change attempt. How will you go about eliciting others' support? Is that a phone call? Is that an email? Is that a way of connecting with someone who's going to provide that kind of support? How do you know the plan is working? And some things that could interfere with your plan. We talk about predictable, anticipated obstacles that we can address. We can shore up our toolkit to ensure that we have what it takes to manage. So that's one of the motivation enhancement strategies we use in terms of really revisiting our goals and the process to getting to our goals. Never forget, we have to continuously be conditioning your practice muscle, so that stamina and energy can only improve by progressively increasing your workload. You have to keep working through it. Each time you have to push yourself a little bit farther, past the point where you become tired. So the first sign of tiredness is not an indication or permission to quit. It's really a reminder that you are making tangible progress and you need to push a little beyond. We talk about, even in development of goals, we want to have goals that are reachable, but we want to make sure that they give us some effort and ability to stretch a little beyond our comfort zone, because that's what keeps us motivated, knowing that we have to stretch a little. So that's going to be important. So your goal is to really get that 30 to 60 minutes per day. But if you can only do 5 minutes, do it for a few days and then move up to 10, and the next week increase to 15 minutes. 20 minutes and keep on increasing until you get to 30 minutes, and until you get to 60 minutes, you kind of consciously get there. But by now in this process, you should have been able to really condition your practice muscle to the point where you're somewhere within the 45 to 60 minutes range of working on hoarding. So you have to ask yourself, what is your practice muscle strength right now? And think of it, ask yourself that question and lend to me some feedback. Where do you think your practice muscle strength is right now on a scale, of, let's say, 10 to 60 minutes? Where are you? I know for me, many a days, it's somewhere between that 50 to 60 minutes. And I try to impart that on the people that I support and help as well. You've got to stay within that 45 to 60 minutes. Melody says 30 minutes, and that's understandable. I think it's also, as we know, based on the extent of the challenge, because for some folks 30 minutes may be practical and efficacious if the degree of the challenge may lend itself to that. But you need to be somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes to really be gaining the dividends from your efforts. So that's going to be critical to remember. Fantastic. 60 for a caregiver I support. That's great. And I can tell you, as we continue to support others, sometimes it helps with our own motivation, because we have to model and set the example. And sometimes that reminds us that we need to get on the horse ourselves. Keep on at it. So we talk about, the bad guy number 3, excuses that promote avoidance. And for a lot of people, this can be, shame imposing. And this can really tag at your emotional sense of self, sense of control. But it's important to recognize that oftentimes, consciously or unconsciously, we make a lot of excuses that really promote avoidance, that really harpen into avoidance. And some of those excuses are known to us. I'm too tired to do this right now. And that's great, Melanie, working 1 to 2 hours a week. That's fantastic. So you think of some of the other excuses. I'm too stressed out to work on my hoarding problems. I wouldn't be able to tolerate it if I felt bad. And then we all can, like a chorus, remind folks, your feeling bad is not all bad. It's a feeling. And feelings come and go, and we have control, and we can manage those feelings. And feeling bad means that you're actually challenging the bad guy. So it's okay to feel bad. As a matter of fact, if you're not feeling bad, you may have a problem. So feeling bad is not bad. It's kind of, paradoxical in a sense, but that's the truth. Oh, I like that one, Christina. But my back hurts. And I always say the same thing. If you sit in the same spot watching the cluttered stuff, your back will hurt just as well. But you wouldn't have gained anything from the back hurting. So yes, acknowledge that excuses are going to be there. We're not saying that everything that someone says to you is going to be deemed an excuse, because some are legitimate. If someone is saying, I can't physically do this, then we need to explore that. Maybe it's time for them to visit a physician and get evaluated to determine whether or not there's a strain or something that is restrictive physically. We don't want to walk around thinking every proclamation is an excuse, but here are some examples that can guide your discernment as to what really falls into those excuse elements. So that's critical and important to note. So once we begin to have those excuses become prevalent and prominent, we want to think through. So we avoid the catastrophizing, right? We want to make sure that we're thinking. We're thinking people. We're thought-oriented and process-oriented. We're not just going to react to every feeling that we have. So when upset or emotional or vulnerable, it's natural for us to underestimate our capacity and commitment, and sometimes even to overestimate the extent of the challenge or possible undesired outcome. So we get into that whole catastrophizing where, it's easy to be like, I just can't do this. It's just too much, right? Or you begin to think, well, I tried, but I'm failing miserably. You have to be very cautious about that. Or you get into that emotional overload and you perceive your own inability to cope. And we talk about how we think it through. We talked about that last month, how we make attempts to work through those processes, look for evidence, really challenge the hypothesis, that negative thinking, those thinking that really we want to see if it's valid, if it's really going to happen, if it's really true, and then be able to process beyond that. So we talk about being careful not to discount the negative or discount the positive, so to speak, in the sense that when things are, even if things are incremental and minuscule in their positivity, we don't want to discount it. We don't want to ignore that and only focus on the things that are not happening the way we want them to happen. So you think of the typical, pros and cons of I can't, that whole giving in, as opposed to let me figure out how I can. Or instead of saying I can't, acknowledge that I am struggling. This is a challenge. Because that articulation promotes more of a figuring out process. We talk about how powerful those words are. The way we articulate our concerns can even promote change behavior, change action, change talk. It's going to be critical for us to have that in a sense. And I love that, Christina. She says, my favorite is I need caffeine first. Oh, absolutely. For some of us, we do need caffeine first. And I said, if you need caffeine first, then you should be making that coffee before you start the process, right? Before you start the stuff, have your coffee ready. And in some instances, we also know that we have natural hormones that really drive our motivation. Sometimes we get into that mode. So it's critical and important to avoid catastrophizing, really recognize that some of these can be reframed in a way that really allows us to really move in a direction of change, and have a sense of possibility, as opposed to it's all, it's all bad. Testing it out, the validity of the assumptions, really discerning whether or not what we are thinking, those first thoughts, those assumptions are true. Do they have validity? Do they have authenticity? So we're not driving ourselves, up the wall with the things that come into our minds in any given moment, in any given day. Because you think of it, most of the time when we allow ourselves to imagine the worst and stick with the image of it for a while, it starts to seem less realistic and perhaps even a bit silly. When I think of it's one of those things that I hate to use kind of a trivial, a childish example. When you think of it, you think of growing up as a child, you think of the boogeyman, right? from the moment but as you think more and more of the boogeyman, some of the elements of it don't seem that realistic. And then you begin to revisit that, reframe it, like, is it really a boogeyman? Or maybe somebody who's just scary. And you start thinking about it in that process. Similarly, that's how we try to process that stuff. We imagine the worst that can happen if you do experience unpleasant feelings. And ask yourself, have you experienced unpleasant feelings before? Right? And what happened? You're still around? You didn't die? In some instances, it's really that clear and definitive. But we have a process of really testing it out. And we want you to take those steps, because we don't want you doing it off the cuff and just coming up with your own, because we don't want you to ignore them either, because they will then, as we know, build up even into more profound obstacles. So imagine the worst that can happen if you did experience that unpleasant feeling. I want you to rate the vividness and the scariness of that outcome on a scale of 1 to 10. So if you think of the most negative, unpleasant feeling that you have, if the outcome that you're fearful the most occurs, we want you to assess its scariness on a scale of 0 being not so scary, 10 being extremely scary. I mean, screaming and hollering scary. And then how vivid and scary does that image seem? Once you've processed, I want you to sit with those thoughts for 10 minutes, uninterrupted minutes. With just the scariest thought, just sit with it for 10 minutes. I think of it as, okay, I just think of that whole concept of my scariest thought is I'm just going to be unable to do anything. And I'm going to sit here in the middle of this pile and I'm going to feel the worst I've ever felt in my life. I want you to sit with that for 10 minutes. As we know, as you get into the third minute and the fourth minute, you start thinking, okay, yeah, it's scary. You get into the fifth minute, you start beginning to process, okay. So if I feel that terrible and that awful, I'm here, I'm in my house, I still have to live here, I still have to process, I have to figure out what's for dinner, I have to do some other things. Now you ask yourself as you get into 6 to 7 minutes, how scary does it really seem now? Because you begin to almost distance yourself more and more from that feeling as you begin to process the reality of your circumstance. And more as you get into that 10th minute, it seems less and less realistic and even a bit trivial. Like, it's like, okay, that was just a scary thought. I'm able to cope with that. I can actually move beyond that because I've sat in this same space. I've had that same thought before. And guess what? I didn't die. It didn't end. I didn't stop being capable. I didn't stop being an adult. I didn't stop having responsibility for my own welfare and my own welfare. I actually moved beyond it at some point. I don't know. I may not remember exactly, but I know because I'm still sitting here. I'm standing here. I'm still making those efforts. So we want you to go through that process, thinking the most scary, establishing its vividness, how scary it is, sitting with it for 10 minutes, being mindful, that mindfulness exercise for 10 minutes, and then really revisiting its significance over time. And once again, we talk about don't be afraid to test the validity of your thinking. Is it valid? Speak it out. Put it out into existence, examine it, both vocally, cognitively, and really, if you a person that prefers to write it down in that moment and then revisit it after 10 minutes. And sometimes you can have a whole different concept of how you view it, how you see yourself in connection with that particular thought 10 minutes ago. So we use the downward arrow in this particular sense to really test the validity of that thought. You think about the worst thing, you go through that whole process. You ask yourself, if you feel the way that you did, would it be the worst thing that could happen? If that did happen, what's so bad about that? What's so bad about experiencing just that fear of, I don't know if I can manage this for 10 minutes? And how long do you think it would take you to recover? The reason why we use a 10-minute mark is typically once we're able to process a thought for 10 minutes, by just natural concept, our brain really pushes that thought into a different kind. So we're able to, because we have to take on new information coming in. We can't sustain that single stop for more than 10 to 15 minutes. So we have to move on. So that hence why we use that kind of time frame. And it may not mean that we're not scared or we're not concerned or depressed. It means that we're able to tolerate it and think the next thought and process the next event in our lives, understanding that there's going to be more coming throughout the day. So we talk about steps to hypothesis testing, really testing through that whole process of what am I thinking? Is it as bad as it seems? Am I going to be able to cope with it? Am I being able to survive this thought? Is this really a fact that the worst case scenario is going to happen? And even if it does, what is going to be the outcome? Am I going to be able to sustain, thrive, and move beyond that? So what bad outcome would happen if you let go of the item? Think of that. The feeling that when I really need it, I'm not going to have it. That's a real feeling. But as you also know, if you've used the categorizing, the organizing, you would know that at some point you evaluated whether or not you absolutely needed it. And the reason why it's in the discard box and discard column is because you were able to process that credit card receipt from 2 years ago, as much as it would be handy to have, was not needed. Because every subsequent credit card bill had the previous balance in the previous bill. You also know that you can always access it going to the credit card company's website. You can look at your bank account and see that stuff. Or even if it's a, I always say the 14th black shoe that you have, you also know that you've counted 13 others that you have available to you in case you need it. So even though the 14th one was the wedge heel that is just perfect for certain occasions, you've also been able to extrapolate and to analyze that you've got 2 other wedge heels that you can actually use in those wedge heel only moments. So it's about utilizing all the planning that you've put in place and really testing the hypothesis of the current thought and the current feeling and emotion that is challenging your movement. So we talk about avoiding the temptation of the short-term payoff. That's the most significant bad guy that comes in and disrupts our good work. Really, that short-term payoff, because as we all know, short-term payoffs are a real, it challenges us. Because when you feel uncomfortable or upset about getting rid of a possession that you realize you didn't need to keep, it's easier to feel better by saying, maybe I just hold on to it, right? And maybe I just hold on to it. Think of when you see a bargain or treasure and can't help but imagine the thrill of acquiring it. These are examples of short-term payoff that makes us feel better momentarily, but unfortunately, the long-term consequences are more clutter, frustration, and dysfunction, depression, negative feeling, all the other things that we were striving to avoid, striving to overcome, is what becomes the long-term consequence of short-term payoff. So we have to be careful about the path of least resistance, how tempting that can be. We have to be conscientious not to fall into the mode of that kind of emotional reasoner, Really believing things are true because we just have that feeling about it. And having difficulty separating emotions from facts. Being able to process through that whole element. Not stopping at just a feeling, but really process, is this a fact? Is my world going to end because I have this feeling of dread, or feeling of fear, or anxiety, or uncertainty, or incompetence? It's momentary. Avoiding catastrophizing. Always expecting the worst to happen. Understanding clearly that things can go bad. It doesn't mean it's all or nothing. Avoiding the black and white thinking, the blaming, the catastrophizing, the excuse making. Being careful not to be an uncertainty hater, deeply uncomfortable not knowing how things will turn out. The one thing we learn is that we don't have control over everything that is going to happen in our lives. What we have control over is how we react to them. What space we give them in our domain in our lives. What control we give them in terms of disturbing or deregulating or derailing our efforts. We can control that. And not only can we should, we ought to, we're capable of, we have a plan to do so. So these are just a few of the bad guys we talk about: recognizing, acknowledging, addressing, and moving beyond. So we really establish a recognition of the challenge, a way in which we can acknowledge them, know what they are, establishing clearly and applying the appropriate coping mechanism and strategy to address it, and then revisiting the outcomes subsequent to that. So don't remember, thinking it through means stop, identify the slip-up, and examine the evidence. Because feelings aren't facts. They're just feelings. And they are something that we can control, we can manage. We can actually determine what impact we're going to give, what power we're going to give it in our lives. So we look at all the examples. I feel uncomfortable about discarding this, so this means I should keep it. Does it mean that? No, it means you're feeling uncomfortable about it. That's the difference. And then we ask ourselves, so when I feel uncomfortable, what do I do? when I feel uncomfortable about making a decision, I go through my decisional balance and how do I make my decisions, understanding all the quadrants of making a decision, what I'm going to gain and what I'm going to lose. Then I make the decision. And then I test to determine whether or not that feeling was actually, an evidence of fact. No, it isn't. It's a feeling, and I taught, and it should spur me to action, to resolution action. So those are critical elements for us to be aware of. So I asked the question, have you felt one way about something and then turned out the other way? Has that ever happened to you? Speak to me, let me know. Have you ever thought this is how something is going to happen? Lo and behold, turns out the other way. Great. So like myself, most people have had that experience.
Yes, all the time. I might have a big, long conversation in my head with somebody else, and I think that's how it's going to go. And then afterward, it's like, oh, that didn't go that way at all. And
precisely. Absolutely. And it's an everyday occurrence for most of us. What is oftentimes the thing that we don't do is to bag that, seal that, put a label on it, and keep it for when we are uncertain. And to remind ourselves that it's there. Because I always think of it from that sense of when you're in that control of those emotions, you're thinking, oh my God, this is just going to turn out bad. Like, hold on a minute. Not everything that I taught turned out bad. Why am I giving this stuff so much power? Why am I allowing myself to default to worst case scenario? Now, you don't necessarily have to default to best case scenario. What you do is that you stand there in evidence of what's happening. You look at what this specific situation is and you assess it as such. You give it its due diligence, its due oversight. And that's important and critical to know, in a sense that not all things are going to turn out terrible. And Sarah Lynn says, I was nervous about being accepted to the state for a band in high school and was told to write down the worst case scenario. One of those scenarios actually came through having a Linden High School student for a roommate. Actually turned out she was the most mature and friendly person. Isn't that fantastic? That is, and that's just an example. I always say, if we can just oftentimes pull that up, have that kind of almost automatic pull up, it will save us a lot of unnecessary distress. Or even if it's disturbing, we can be stressed, but not necessarily distressed by it. So it's really, what do we give power to? But that's a great way of looking at it. So we look at the cognitive restructuring concept to really help us process those negative thoughts, those negative emotions, and recognize how they impact our behavior. So negative thinking patterns that derail our efforts to continue new behavior is going to be important for us to really have a handle on in this stage of change. What we suggest and recommend is to use cognitive restructuring to challenge and change unproductive and unhealthy thoughts that inform behaviors. And we've gone through a lot of that already today. But we have a specific technique, a cognitive restructuring strategy that we promote and we encourage people to use when those thoughts and unhealthy emotions come to bear in terms of trying to derail your efforts. It's called catch it, check it, change it. I don't know how familiar any of you are with the catch it, check it, change it strategy. But it's a really simple process to really help you restructure your thoughts when you're faced with those negative thoughts and emotions. So when we talk about catch it, we want you to really look clearly and concertedly at what is the thought? What am I really thinking? Acknowledge it, write it down, put it somewhere clear and distant so you know exactly what you're thinking. And once you're able to do that, then you want to check it. And that's really testing that hypothesis that we've talked about. Is it credible and is it a true thought? I think of that concept of, I cannot function without coffee. Now, is that a common thought? But is it credible? Is it true? Let's think of that for a moment. When you say, I cannot function without coffee, I can't think, I can't process anything without coffee. Just think of that statement, how common that is made. But is it credible? Is it true? No, it seems logical, right? Because most of the time you said it enough that you begin to believe it, but it doesn't make it a fact. Because in essence, we know coffee actually stays in our system and have that kind of impact in our system for a period of time. And unless you are hooked up to an IV with coffee, there's going to be some time in your day that you're not under the influence of coffee and you have to make decisions. So at some point, you have to be able to discern that you've made decisions and process without coffee. Now, yet you prefer to make those decisions once you've had your morning cup of joe. That's a different element. That's a preference as opposed to, a realistic fact of what you're capable of. There you go, Kathy. You've got it very correct. You're able to function enough to make the coffee. So it means you have to be able to function without the coffee. That's a lovely one. That's a fantastic one. I'm going to keep that. Permission to reuse that. So once you catch it and you check it, then the next step, and the most critical step, is changing it. What is a more accurate and helpful thought? And we talk about it in the coffee reference. Yes, I feel a lot better when I have my coffee, but I'm capable of making decisions without coffee. That's an accurate thought. That's changing that perception of it. So then you know that you have the option of either doing things in a preferential way or not, but you're capable of doing it in either concept. And the same goes for that hoarding concept, in the sense of, I can't do this as your first thought, and you check it and be like, yeah, I can. I've done it before. I've done it yesterday. And then you change that negative thought, or you change that derailing thought by saying, listen, right now I'm struggling with making that decision, and I need to figure out a way to make that decision in a more concerted way. That's the change of the thought that moves to change in behavior, that moves to an awareness and an understanding of how to really move beyond that initial feeling of incapability or vulnerability. So when thought patterns become destructive and self-defeating, it's a good idea to explore ways to interrupt and redirect them. That's what cognitive restructuring do. It really helps you to reframe and redirect those negative thoughts into both positive action, or action that can really help you change the thought into a more productive behavior. So that's one example of a cognitive restructuring ways of doing things. We have other approaches that we use for really helping you process negative thoughts. So examine the basis for your decision. It's always important to be able to look at why you make the decision and the impact of those decisions. Think of, people's belief about possessions. They're oftentimes out of sync with how they want to live. But these beliefs are seldom examined or evaluated to determine if they're consistent with your goals and values. And that's important for you to revisit. I don't feel comfortable letting go of this old clock. And it's really, making my day miserable. I'm just feeling out of sorts. I can't do anything because I can't determine what I should do here. Well, then you have to examine that. Determine if it's consistent with your goal. Is this going to help me with my discarding, decluttering, holding on to this clock? Even though I've spent the last 3 months going from goal development to implementation, I know fully well that I have a watch, a cell phone, a grandfather's clock in the living room. I have 4 other ways of telling the time. I don't need to hold on to this broken clock that hasn't worked in the last 2 years. Really going through that process. Why is it likely to be the most stressful and difficult part of the program for you? You will have to risk not having something when you need it and getting rid of things you like. That is just part of the deal. We have processed that. We've revisited that a million times. There are going to be things that you're going to have to get rid of that is going to make you feel uncomfortable. But there's a purpose and a goal and a vision that is going to result from making that decision. So then we think of continuing to test out the exercise, do not testing out exercise, testing it out to its completeness, really going through that process. So we want to make sure that every time we hit one of those obstacles, we think it through, we process it through, we go through it to the extent that we get some way of formulating a frame of a reference that we can take away to the next time we're faced with an obstacle. We have a cache, a point of reference we can go back to remind us of our resilience, our capabilities, and what we're capable of doing. So we want to make sure that you keep this process in your head when you are thinking through those thoughts, testing out it, looking at the predictions, how strongly do you believe them, what happened, what was the final discomfort. So there's that testing out exercise that you can do once you face any major obstacles to help you really get to the other side of it. And remember to look at the forest and not just the trees. So look at the big picture. Why are you doing all of this? Why are you enduring all of this discomfort and challenge? And it's all about the values and the goals that you develop for beating hoarding, to re-examining, revisiting that space that you have, the life you want to live, the environment you want to have for yourself. Earlier in the process, you identified important reasons for decluttering and beating hoarding. This need or goal is definitely more important than a short-term payoff. Likely the object of, something on the store. It is always more important to really be working on your goals than to get those short-term payoffs, because we understand the long-term consequences. So look at the forest, not just for the trees. Are you giving yourself credit for the progress you've made already? It's another way of examining where you are and where you're going. Because we talk about ensuring that you're really acknowledging the work and effort and the benefits of what you've put in already. So remember, you need to make a genuine commitment to the reward system. We developed the reward system earlier. It's going to be critical and important to do that. And Sarah Lynn says, I personally have found giving myself credit difficult, but I'm not sure why. It is not uncommon, Sarah Lynn. In many cases, we end up in that state where giving credit seems like a selfish act. The reality is, how do we then process that? Is it really credit in a way that we're actually having something to actually point to say that we have accomplished, and therefore the credit is not some inappropriate reward or something that is more bloviating or some kind of way of looking at it as really fulfilling some ego element, but more so a matter of it's part of the plan. The rewards drives the next action. So even though you're giving yourself credit, it's a form of motivation for your next step, as opposed to some gaudy reward for just being the best person that you can be. And I'm hoping that helps kind of get you into the framework. And I always say, if you can't do it for yourself, this is where support comes in. It is okay to have someone else do that for you. You don't need to do it necessarily for yourself, but recognizing that is important. So earlier you established a reward system in which you give yourself a specific reward if you spend the necessary amount of time working on hoarding. If it's not, it's time to implement that reward system, because that's going to really sustain your motivation, keep you on track, and remind you as to why is it you're doing this, and that there's actually dividends from doing this. So really be reminded to put that reward system in place. For some folks, it's once I've completed 30 minutes or 60 minutes of hoarding, I then grant myself the opportunity to watch my favorite episode of whatever it is at night, with my favorite beverage, and that's my reward. For some people, the reward is to be able to enjoy that space, whatever that space may be, or to actually put up a artifact or something in the space that you cleared to remind yourself of the connection with something significant and tangible to you. I know one of my clients said he had this jade Buddha that he wanted to display prominently to really reflect his spiritual belief, and he couldn't wait until he was able to clear the space to put it in a prominent place, and that was his reward for clearing that space. Absolutely, or use the behavior reward pairing. Absolutely, those are definitely strategies to ensure that the morale and commitment is maintained. Have you stuck to that plan? Have you become so engaged and busy that you forgot to reward yourself? Sometimes it happens, but you need to be conscientious. That's a critical part of what you do. Don't forget your practice muscles. We have to keep conditioning the practice muscle, working on our stamina and our energy. The stronger your practice muscle, the less likely you are to give in to the short-term payoff. Because if you're doing it every day, if you're working on that schedule, the short-term payoff is not necessary because you're seeing the daily benefits. It will be much easier to keep your goals in mind when your practice muscle is well-conditioned and you're above 30 minutes. So that's critical to note. That's why we keep focusing on the practice muscle. So I want to wrap up in a way that allows us to really look at what we have garnered today. I want to share with you the evaluation for today. As you know, it's always important for us to get feedback from you as to how the sessions are going, what can be done differently, what is being done in a way that is already helpful. We just want to make sure that you're providing us feedback so we can continue to shape and process. So I put the evaluation link in the chat. You can certainly click on it and complete the evaluation, quick few seconds, and get that done. Just want to make sure that we are on par. So our next element is to really take a look at our learning application and our next meeting schedule. So as you know, our next meeting is going to be in December. So we do every other month. So our next meeting is 12/12 at the same time. What is important is the learning application for this month, because every time we complete a chapter in a segment, we want to make sure that you're practicing using those elements. So I want to try to share the clutter visualization and the unclutter visualization exercise in the downward arrow so that you're able to practice that processing and thinking it through. And then we'll talk next in December about how helpful you found it or how challenging it was. And be reminded that in December, we're going to be addressing and focusing on chapter 12, which is Here Come the Bad Guys, taking on your brain, really looking at those cognitive processes that really support or derail your efforts. And remember that you're using the same link you already registered, so that should be good. I want to thank you. We appreciate your time, attention, and participation. And today's webinar was hosted by DBHR through the Washington Healthcare Authority. I want to remind you that the slides and the link to the recording of this session and other resources will be forwarded to you via email. Don't forget to check your foundational community support newsletter for all things FCS and upcoming trainings that are sponsored by both DBHR and in contract with Washington, with Rutgers University. So if you have any questions, we just have about a minute and a half. I'll certainly be happy to address those questions. No, we're not meeting in November, Debbie. We meet every other. My apologies. I'm sincerely apologize. I think I just confused that with my other learning community. We're meeting in November, so my apologies. I will send the dates for November. We meet monthly. My sincerest apologies. Earl is multitasking. That's one of the reasons why I have my learning communities mixed up. But we will meet in November. Those dates will be made available to you and sent out to you. So that's fantastic. So if there's any questions, please feel free. We have like a minute. Otherwise, I want to bid you adieu. thank you for participating and being here today. Look forward to seeing you in November.
I had a question.
Go ahead, Debbie.
I started working on the evaluation, but then I took time out to say, so we're not meeting in November, and then you answer, yes, we are meeting in November.
Yeah.
And now I can't get back to the,
Oh, you can't
to
get back
my-
to the evaluation?
yeah, what I started on.
Okay. I may
I
have,
think-
let me see if I can put it in
I-
again. Maybe you
well-
can click it again.
Okay, I'll go into the chat and go
Yeah.
there again.
There you go.
Okay, all right, thanks.
You're welcome, Debbie. I know. The machinations, right? We live in the virtual world. Hopefully we'll
Oh,
be able to
goodness.
meet in the same space and be able to address this pretty soon, hopefully. Keep our fingers crossed. But thank you all once again, and do enjoy the rest of your day, and look forward to seeing you next month. Take good care.